September 27, 1605. The sun begins to rise over a frozen field 3 miles east of Kircholm in the contested borderlands between the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and Sweden's Baltic territories. Grand Hetman Konstanty Radziwiłł sits completely still on his warhorse, watching 23,000 Swedish foot soldiers form their battle lines across the frost-hardened field. The morning sun shines on their pike spear tips. A forest of steel stretching wider than his entire army. His own army, barely 9,000 horsemen and 2,000 foot soldiers, stands out in the open on ground that offers no advantage. No hills to protect the sides, no forest to hide their movements. Just open field and the Swedish cannons already aiming at their positions. Officers shift nervously in their saddles around him. Hands move without thinking to sword handles. Eyes calculate distances that all lead to the same conclusion. They are outnumbered nearly 3-1. The enemy holds the better position and Commonwealth foot soldier reserves are still 2 days of marching away. Every tactical rule says retreat. Fall back to defensive walls at Riga. Save the horsemen for winter battles. Live to fight another day. But Radziwiłł cannot retreat. Not after what happened at Lubeck. Not after the killings. Not after he personally promised King Sigismund that Swedish attacks would be answered with steel and blood. He gives an order that will be remembered in military history for centuries. Hussars to the center. Cossack light horsemen to the sides. When their cannons start firing, we charge. His officers stare in disbelief. Charging prepared Swedish foot soldiers with horsemen across open ground into heavy musket and pike fire. It's suicide dressed up as tactics. Radziwiłł meets their eyes one by one. Sweden believes this continent belongs to the strong. They believe our Commonwealth is weak, divided, and ready for conquest. Today we teach them that honor and desperation make men stronger than ambition ever could. He pulls out his saber, the same blade his grandfather carried at the Battle of Orsha, when outnumbered Lithuanian horsemen destroyed a Russian army twice their size. If we die here, we die as free men defending our land. If we run, we die as slaves watching our homes burn. I choose the first death. Who rides with me? Every officer pulls out their saber. Before we continue, if this kind of deep historical storytelling is what you're here for, do me a favor, hit that like button, and drop a comment. It really helps this video reach people who care about real history, not the cleaned-up version. Now, let's continue because what's about to happen will rewrite the rules of warfare and solve absolutely nothing. To understand the disaster at Kircholm, you have to understand the royal family disaster that came before it. In 1587, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, an elected kingdom stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, ruling lands larger than France, made what seemed like a smart political move. They elected Sigismund Vasa as their king. Sigismund was the son of Sweden's King John III, educated in Jesuit schools, Catholic to his core, and more Polish in personality than Swedish. The Commonwealth's powerful nobles believed this arrangement could eventually unite Poland, Lithuania, and Sweden under one crown, creating a Baltic superpower capable of competing with the Habsburgs. For 5 years, the plan seemed to work. Then in 1592, John III died and Sigismund inherited the Swedish throne. Technically, he now ruled both kingdoms, a personal union that should have created the most powerful state in Northern Europe. Instead, it created a nightmare. Sweden's nobles and citizens had grown comfortable with Protestant independence. They had spent decades removing Catholic influence, building a reformed church, and making Sweden a stronghold of Lutheran belief. Now, their king was Catholic, educated by Jesuits, ruling from Krakow, while Sweden suffered under regency councils. Sigismund tried to balance both kingdoms. He promised Swedish Protestants he wouldn't force Catholicism on them. He appointed regents he thought he could trust. He traveled between Warsaw and Stockholm trying to satisfy two nations with completely different ideas of government. But the Commonwealth operated as an elected kingdom where nobles held enormous power and the king ruled through agreement. Sweden was moving towards centralized royal power where the crown's word was law. The Commonwealth embraced religious tolerance as a founding principle. Sweden demanded Protestant uniformity. Sigismund was trying to rule two nations that wanted opposite things from their king. And waiting in Sweden was his uncle, Duke Karl of Södermanland, a man who understood that crisis creates opportunity. Duke Karl was everything Sigismund was not. Where Sigismund was scholarly and diplomatic, Karl was ruthless and decisive. Where Sigismund looked for compromise, Karl saw only weakness. And where Sigismund believed in legitimate succession and divine right, Karl believed in power and the will to use it. In 1598, while Sigismund was in Poland managing Commonwealth business, Karl staged a coup. He claimed he was protecting Sweden from Catholic contamination and foreign rule. He declared that Sigismund, by staying in Poland and ruling through regents, had effectively abandoned the Swedish throne. Karl proclaimed himself regent with full royal power and began systematically removing anyone loyal to the legitimate king. Catholic clergy were kicked out of Swedish territories. Commonwealth merchants operating in Stockholm, Gothenburg, and other Swedish cities were arrested on false charges of spying. Anyone who publicly recognized Sigismund's authority over Sweden was imprisoned or executed. Sigismund, ruling from Poland, declared Karl a traitor and usurper. He demanded Karl submit to legitimate royal authority. He sent diplomatic letters threatening military action if Karl didn't stand down. Karl responded by raiding Commonwealth Baltic ports. For 7 years from 1598 to 1605, this festered like an infected wound. Swedish privateers seized Commonwealth merchant ships. Commonwealth coastal towns were raided by Swedish forces who would strike, burn, and withdraw before reinforcements arrived. Captured merchants from both sides were hanged as spies and traitors, their bodies displayed in port cities as warnings. Diplomatic letters between Stockholm and Warsaw read like declarations of war written by men too proud to sign them formally. The Commonwealth was already fighting the Ottomans on its southern border. Sweden was engaged in wars with Russia over Livonian territory. Neither nation could afford full-scale war with each other. But neither would back down. And Duke Karl, now calling himself Karl IX despite never being legitimately crowned, understood something Sigismund didn't. He understood that provocations short of formal war could achieve strategic goals without triggering the kind of massive military response that would unite the Commonwealth against him. So Karl pushed. He occupied disputed territories. He executed Commonwealth citizens on weak pretexts. He tested how far he could go before Sigismund would be forced to respond with more than diplomatic protests. In June 1605, Karl discovered exactly where that line was and he crossed it. Lübeck was a free city on the Baltic coast, nominally independent but economically tied to everyone. For decades, it had profited by playing both sides, hosting merchants from Gdansk and Stockholm alike. Its warehouses were filled with grain, timber, amber, and Swedish iron. In June 1605, Duke Karl sent troops to occupy Lübeck. His official justification was that the city had been harboring Polish troublemakers and violating Swedish trade interests. His actual goal was Lübeck's wealth and strategic position. What he got was an excuse for massacre. On July 12, 1605, Swedish troops rounded up 43 merchants and city officials accused of maintaining loyalty to Sigismund. There was no trial, no opportunity to defend themselves, no appeal to higher authority. They were executed in Lübeck's central square. Swedish soldiers built gallows hastily in the pre-dawn darkness. At first light, the condemned men were brought out in groups of 7. One group was hanged, their bodies left dangling, while the next group was prepared. Then another 7, then another. Citizens who tried to intervene were beaten back by Swedish soldiers. The city council protested. They were ignored. Letters of safe passage and diplomatic immunity were presented. They were torn up and thrown in the mud. By noon, all 43 men were dead. Among them was Micha Radziwiłł, younger brother of Grand Hetman Konstanty Radziwiłł. Micha was 32 years old. He had a wife 8 months pregnant with their third child. He was in Lübeck negotiating grain shipments to feed Commonwealth armies fighting the Ottomans on the southern border. He was a merchant, not a soldier. He carried letters of safe passage signed by both Commonwealth and Swedish authorities guaranteeing his protection under international law. Swedish soldiers hanged him anyway. According to the servant who escaped and brought news to Konstanty, Mika prayed in Polish as the noose was placed around his neck. Swedish soldiers mocked him, imitating his prayers in crude accents, laughing as his face turned purple and his body shook. It took several minutes for him to die. Long minutes where his legs kicked and his hands clawed at the rope before finally going still. When the bodies were cut down, Swedish authorities refused to release them to families or servants for proper burial. All 43 corpses were dumped in a mass grave outside the city walls, covered with quicklime and left unmarked. Mika's servant managed to escape the city with only his master's personal belongings, a leather purse containing a few coins, a prayer book, and letters from his wife describing their children and asking when he would return home. The servant rode for 2 weeks to reach Konstanty at his military headquarters near the Ottoman border. He delivered the belongings and described the execution in detail Konstanty would never forget. Konstanty Radziwiłł was not a man who showed emotions easily. He had commanded horsemen since age 19. He had fought Tatars, Cossacks, and rebellious nobles. He had seen men die in every possible way, cut down in battle, dying slowly from infected wounds, executed for desertion or cowardice. He was a professional soldier in an age when violence was the common language of politics. But when he heard how his brother died, witnesses said the hetman wept. Then he stopped weeping, and his face became something harder than grief. He requested an immediate audience with King Sigismund. The meeting happened at the Royal Palace in Warsaw on August 3, 1605. Konstanty Radziwiłł rode for 3 days without stopping, changing horses at post stations, sleeping perhaps 4 hours total. He arrived at the palace still wearing his campaign uniform, dust-covered from the road, eyes bloodshot from exhaustion and grief. He did not wait for formal protocol or scheduled audiences. He entered the royal chambers where King Sigismund was meeting with his council and knelt before the throne. "Your Majesty, Duke Karl has murdered Commonwealth citizens under false pretenses. He has violated every principle of diplomatic immunity and civilized law. He occupies territories that belong to your crown by right of legitimate succession, and he will continue escalating his provocations until you answer force with force." The royal council erupted. Chancellor Zamoyski immediately objected that the Commonwealth was already fighting the Ottomans, that the treasury was depleted from years of southern warfare, that opening another front against Sweden would stretch resources beyond breaking. Better to file diplomatic protests, seek mediation through the Holy Roman Emperor, exhaust peaceful options before resorting to war. Bishop Moszyjowski argued that Christian nations should not make war on each other while the Ottoman threat remained. That Swedish provocations, however unjust, did not justify plunging 2 Catholic and Protestant nations into conflict that would only benefit the Turks. Other councillors pointed out that Sweden had superior naval power, that Commonwealth trade routes through the Baltic could be strangled, that Karl had alliances with German Protestant princes who might join the war. Every argument was sound, every objection was reasonable, and Konstanty listened to all of it with a face like stone. When the council finished presenting their objections, Radziwiłł rose to his feet. He did not ask permission to speak. He simply spoke, and his voice carried the cold certainty of a man who had already made peace with death. "Your Majesty, I do not speak as your hetman now. I speak as a brother seeking justice for murder. But I tell you this, if the Commonwealth does not answer Swedish aggression, Duke Karl will interpret silence as weakness. He will seize more territory, execute more merchants, raid more ports until the Baltic is his lake, and the Commonwealth is too weakened to resist." He pulled out his saber and laid it on the marble floor before the king. A symbolic gesture offering resignation. "If you choose peace, I will respect your decision. I will resign my command and ride north with whatever men will follow me. I will find Duke Karl or his commanders or his soldiers, and I will have blood for blood. I would prefer to do this with your blessing and the Commonwealth's armies behind me, but I will do it regardless." The chamber fell into shocked silence. A Grand Hetman did not threaten to resign. A military commander did not tell his king that he would pursue personal revenge with or without royal permission. It was close to treason. Or it would have been if Radziwiłł's grief and rage weren't so clearly genuine. King Sigismund III was 48 years old, a scholarly man more comfortable with theology than warfare. He had spent 7 years hoping that his legitimate claim to the Swedish throne could be reclaimed through diplomacy and legal principle rather than blood. He had convinced himself that Duke Karl's coup was temporary, that Swedish nobles would eventually recognize their legitimate king, that right would triumph without requiring war. But looking at Konstanty Radziwiłł, one of the Commonwealth's most capable commanders, offering to throw his life away on a revenge mission that would solve nothing and potentially trigger exactly the war everyone wanted to avoid, Sigismund understood something. He understood that appeasement had limits, that there were provocations no king could ignore without losing his authority, that sometimes the cost of peace was higher than the cost of war. And he understood that Radziwiłł was right. If the Commonwealth didn't respond to Lübeck, Karl would escalate, would keep pushing until the Commonwealth either submitted or was too weak to resist. The king looked at his counselors and saw their reasonable objections and careful calculations. Then he looked at Radziwiłł and saw something more important, the moral authority that comes from being willing to die for principle. On August 5, 1605, King Sigismund III formally declared that Duke Karl's occupation of Lübeck and execution of Commonwealth citizens constituted acts of war. Commonwealth armies would mobilize to liberate Swedish-occupied territories and restore legitimate authority over the contested Baltic provinces. Konstanty Radziwiłł was appointed Supreme Field Commander with authority to engage Swedish forces as he saw fit. Before Radziwiłł left Warsaw, Sigismund called him back for a private conversation in the royal study. No counselors, no clerks, no witnesses. The king poured 2 glasses of Hungarian wine and handed one to Konstanty. Hetman Radziwiłł, I am giving you this war because you have convinced me it is necessary. But I need you to promise me something. Anything, your majesty. Win, not just battles. Win decisively enough that Duke Karl understands the Commonwealth cannot be challenged with impunity. Because if you fail, if our armies are broken in the field, Sweden will not stop at the Baltic. They will push south into our heartland, and we will lack the strength to stop them. Sigismund's voice was steady, but his hands trembled slightly as he held his wine glass. The council is right about our resources. We cannot sustain a long war. We need a victory so complete that Karl sues for peace rather than escalation. Can you deliver that? Konstanty knelt and kissed the royal ring. I swear on my brother's grave and my family's honor, Sweden will learn what it costs to provoke the Commonwealth. It was a promise he would keep at a price so terrible that in his final years, Radziwiłł would wish he had broken that oath and let the injustice stand unanswered. The mobilization began immediately. Riders carried summons to noble estates across the Commonwealth, calling up horseman units. Each landed noble was required to provide mounted soldiers in proportion to the size of their holdings. This was how the Commonwealth raised armies, through feudal obligation rather than standing professional forces. By late August, horseman units were gathering at staging grounds near Riga. Hussars arrived from estates in Lithuania, Poland, and Ruthenia. Each squadron brought its own commanders, its own traditions, its own family pride. These were not professional soldiers serving for pay. These were nobles fighting for honor and obligation. Men whose grandfathers and great-grandfathers had ridden in these same formations. Konstanty inspected each unit personally. He knew many of these men, had fought beside their fathers, had attended their weddings, had stood godfather to their children. Now he was leading them into battle against an enemy with superior numbers and advanced tactics. He assembled his senior commanders and laid out the strategic situation with brutal honesty. Sweden has more soldiers, better cannons, and systematic training we cannot match. If we fight them conventionally, maneuvering for position, engaging in careful tactical chess, we will lose. Their foot soldiers are too disciplined. Their firepower is too concentrated. Our only advantage is the quality of our horsemen and the willingness to use it decisively. What does decisively mean, Hetman? Asked Ostrogski, commander of the right wing. Radziwiłł met his eyes. It means when we find their army, we charge it immediately with everything we have. We break them before their advantages can show themselves, or we die trying. The commanders exchanged glances but said nothing. They understood what Radziwiłł was telling them. This would not be a careful campaign. This would be a single massive gamble. Everything on one throw of the dice. September 26, 1605. Late afternoon. Commonwealth scouts reported that a Swedish army under Field Marshal Arvid Carlsson had deployed in defensive positions near Kircholm, blocking the approach to Riga. The Swedish force numbered approximately 23,000, more than twice Konstanty's strength. Radziwiłł rode forward personally to observe the enemy deployment from a hidden position in the tree line, roughly a mile from the Swedish positions. What he saw confirmed his worst assumptions. The Swedish formation was textbook perfect. Infantry tercios formed the center, dense blocks of pikemen with musketeers in the core. Each tercio positioned to support its neighbors. Cannons were distributed along the front in batteries, creating overlapping fields of fire. Swedish horsemen protected the wings, positioned to counterattack or exploit opportunities. The ground favored the defender. Open field meant clear sight lines for cannons and musket fire. A small stream ran along one edge, not deep enough to stop movement, but enough to disorder horseman formations trying to cross. Low hills on the Swedish-held side provided slight elevation advantage. It was terrain chosen specifically to cancel out cavalry's mobility and expose attacking forces to concentrated firepower. His officers gathered around him as twilight deepened. Ostrogski spoke what everyone was thinking. "Hetman, we cannot attack that position head-on. We should withdraw, wait for our foot soldier reinforcements from Warsaw, and engage the Swedes when we have equal numbers." Konstanty continued studying the Swedish positions for a long moment before responding. "If we withdraw, Karl will claim we fled before his superior forces. Every minor German prince with Baltic ambitions will interpret our retreat as weakness. And King Sigismund will wonder why he gave me this army if I refuse to use it. Better the king questions our courage than we sacrifice 3,000 hussars in a futile charge," another officer said. Radziwiłł turned to face his commanders directly. "Tomorrow at dawn, we attack. Full charge, every hussar directly into their center. We will break through or die in the attempt. There is no third option." Ostrogski stared at him. "Hetman, with respect, that is not tactics. That is suicide." "No," Radziwiłł replied, his voice cold and flat. "Suicide is fighting a long war of attrition against a wealthier enemy with better supply lines. Suicide is letting Karl dictate the terms of engagement. Suicide is explaining to future generations why we had the finest horsemen in Europe and died without using them." He pulled out his saber, the same blade his grandfather had carried at Orsha. "The Swedes expect us to fight like reasonable men, maneuvering, probing for weakness, engaging in careful tactical chess. They have deployed to counter reasonable tactics. So we will do something unreasonable. We will charge their center with every hussar before their cannons have time to aim properly. We will hit their foot soldier line at full gallop while they're still forming up from night positions. And we will break through before their firepower advantage can show itself." "And if we don't break through?" Ostrogski asked quietly. "If their pikes hold and their muskets cut us down?" Radziwiłł's expression was stone. "Then we die well, and our deaths will at least teach the Swedes that the Commonwealth does not yield its honor for tactical caution." No one spoke. In the distance, Swedish drums marked the evening watch change. Finally, Ostrogski nodded. "If we're riding to hell tomorrow, Hetman, at least we'll have good company." Radziwiłł allowed himself the ghost of a smile. "Make sure every man knows the plan. Dawn attack. No trumpet signals that might alert the enemy. We form up in the forest, emerge at first light, and charge immediately. Speed and shock are our only advantages. We use them or we die." The officers left to brief their units. Konstanty remained in the tree line alone, watching Swedish campfires begin to dot the darkening field. He whispered a prayer for his brother's soul, then rode back to prepare for the dawn. The Swedish army that Field Marshal Arvid Carlsson commanded in September 1605 represented the cutting edge of early 17th century warfare. Sweden had spent decades refining military doctrine through constant conflict, wars in Livonia against Russia, campaigns in Estonia, endless skirmishes along contested borders. This experience had forged an army built not on individual heroism, but on systematic training and coordinated tactics. The foundation of Swedish military power was the pike and shot formation. Dense blocks of pikemen armed with 18-foot pikes formed the exterior of each tercio, creating a hedge of steel points that could stop horsemen charges. Protected within this hedge were musketeers armed with matchlock firearms. What made Swedish foot soldiers so deadly wasn't the weapons themselves. Every European army had pikes and muskets. It was the training. Swedish musketeers drilled relentlessly in coordinated volley fire. Rather than each soldier loading and firing independently, creating ragged, ineffective shooting, Swedish units fired in organized ranks. The front rank would fire, then step back to reload, while the second rank fired, then the third. By the time the third rank finished, the first rank was reloaded and ready. This created continuous sustained fire that could devastate attacking formations. 3 organized volleys per minute, each volley representing hundreds of musket balls striking in concentrated impact. It transformed muskets from inaccurate nuisances into battlefield killing machines. Swedish cannons were equally advanced. Most European armies still deployed massive siege guns that took hours to reposition. Sweden had developed lighter field pieces, leather-reinforced bronze cannons that could be moved by horses during battle. These sacrificed some individual hitting power for mobility and rate of fire. A Swedish cannon battery could set up in minutes. Commanders could concentrate guns at critical points, then shift them as the battle evolved. This tactical flexibility gave Swedish forces enormous advantages against enemies still using static cannons. The army Karlsson commanded numbered approximately 23,000 men. 14,000 were foot soldiers organized in tercios. 6,000 were horsemen, ranging from armored riders, heavy horsemen equipped with pistols and swords, to light Finnish scouts used for reconnaissance and skirmishing. 3,000 were artillerists and support troops manning 38 field guns. Arvid Karlsson himself was 42 years old, a professional soldier who had fought in Livonia, Estonia, and along Polish borders for 2 decades. He was methodical, cautious, and absolutely convinced that disciplined Swedish foot soldiers could defeat any horseman force foolish enough to attack them directly. His tactical plan for the engagement near Kircholm was elegantly simple. Deploy in prepared defensive positions with cannon support. Let the Commonwealth horsemen exhaust itself against Swedish pikes and musket volleys, then advance with disciplined foot soldiers and destroy what remained. It was sound thinking based on every principle of contemporary warfare. Pike and shot formations were nearly invulnerable to horsemen charges if properly deployed. Cannons could devastate approaching horsemen at range. Disciplined volley fire created killing zones no mounted warrior could survive. Karlsson had studied every significant horseman engagement of the past 50 years. He understood cavalry's limitations. He understood infantry's advantages. He was confident, not arrogant, but genuinely certain that the coming battle would validate Swedish military superiority. He was marching into a tactical revolution he couldn't anticipate. The Polish-Lithuanian Hussars were not simply mounted warriors. They were a weapon system built around shock, speed, and psychological devastation. Each Hussar was a minor noble responsible for equipping himself and maintaining his war horse. This wasn't mercenary service or feudal levy of peasants given weapons. These were educated men from land-owning families, trained from childhood in horsemanship and combat, investing personal wealth into their equipment. The horses were specifically bred for the role. Standing 15 to 16 hands, they combined size with endurance and speed. Most critically, they were trained to charge directly at pike walls and musket fire without shying away. Intense conditioning that took years and required exceptional skill. The armor was carefully engineered, 3/4 plate that protected the torso, arms, and head while leaving the legs relatively unarmored. This balance maintained mobility while protecting vital areas. Some Hussars wore the distinctive wings, wooden frames mounted on the back armor and fitted with eagle feathers that created a rushing sound during the charge and made the rider appear larger. But the real weapon was the lance. Hussar lances were hollow wooden shafts over 15 feet long, constructed from fir or pine, light enough to hold under the arm, but long enough to reach defenders behind pike points. The critical design feature was that they were meant to shatter on impact. A solid lance that didn't break would jolt backward against the rider, potentially unseating him or breaking his arm from the recoil. A hollow lance that shattered transferred all its kinetic energy into the target, punching through armor, through bodies, through whatever it struck, then breaking apart so the rider could immediately pull out his saber for close combat. The tactical doctrine was brutal in its simplicity. Form up in ranks at safe distance. Accelerate to full gallop over the final 400 yards. Strike the enemy formation at maximum speed with the concentrated mass of armored horsemen and lances converging on a single point. Then break through and wheel for another charge or pursue broken enemies with sabers. It required extraordinary horsemanship. It required courage that bordered on suicidal. It required horses trained to run directly at walls of steel without hesitating. It required timing so precise that the entire formation struck the enemy line in the same instant, concentrating force rather than spreading it out. When it worked, the results were catastrophic. At Orsha in 1514, Lithuanian hussars had shattered a Russian army 3 times their size. At Ula in 1564, they had broken Swedish-Russian foot soldier formations thought impregnable. The psychological impact of several hundred armored horsemen bearing down at full gallop, ground shaking, wings creating an otherworldly sound, lances lowered, was often enough to break enemy morale before the actual impact. Konstanty Radziwiłł commanded approximately 3,000 hussars organized in 5 squadrons plus 4,000 light horsemen, Lipka Tatars and Ukrainian Cossacks who fought as scouts, skirmishers, and pursuit forces. His foot soldiers numbered barely 2,000. Defensive troops meant to protect baggage trains, not fight in pitched battle. Swedish intelligence had reported this composition to Carlson, who interpreted it as confirmation that the Commonwealth force was a raiding party, not a serious army. No commander expecting to fight a major engagement would bring such a horseman-heavy force against prepared foot soldier positions. What Carlson didn't understand was that Radziwiłł wasn't planning to fight a conventional battle. He was planning to charge directly into the Swedish center with every hussar he commanded, break through before Swedish firepower could stop him, and turn the entire enemy formation into chaos before their tactical advantages could show themselves. It was insane. It violated every principle of military caution. It was also the only chance Radziwiłł had. The fundamental problem facing both commanders was that they were preparing for different battles. Carlson expected the Commonwealth horsemen to probe his positions, test for weaknesses, perhaps attempt to outflank his formations or lure parts of his army into disadvantageous terrain. He deployed to counter these reasonable tactics: strong center, protected flanks, cannons positioned to punish any approach. Radziwiłł understood that reasonable tactics would fail against Swedish advantages in firepower and defensive strength. So he planned something unreasonable: a frontal assault at dawn with his entire horseman force, striking before the Swedish army was fully prepared, breaking through before concentrated fire could stop him. Both men were brilliant tacticians. Both were making sound decisions based on their understanding of warfare. But only one understood that this battle would be decided in the first 10 minutes, before tactics and training and firepower could matter. Whoever controlled those first minutes would win. Everything else was irrelevant. On the evening of September 26, Carlson's staff conducted final inspections of the defensive positions. Cannon crews verified range markers. Foot soldier commanders reviewed firing sequences. Horseman leaders positioned their units for morning operations. Everything was ready. The Swedish army settled down for the night, confident that tomorrow would bring a Commonwealth retreat or a futile assault that would be stopped with heavy enemy losses. Across the field in the forests beyond Swedish sight, Commonwealth horsemen prepared in near silence. Horses were fed and watered. Armor was checked and adjusted. Sabers were sharpened. Lances were distributed, each hussar receiving one of the precious hollow shafts that represented months of craftsman's work. Konstanty moved among his men, speaking quietly to squadron commanders, checking equipment, offering words of encouragement. He didn't make speeches. He didn't promise glory or easy victory. He told them the truth. Tomorrow we charge prepared foot soldiers across open ground. Many of us will die, but if enough of us reach their lines, if we strike with concentrated force, we can break them. That's all I can promise, a chance to win if you're brave enough and lucky enough to survive the charge. Men nodded. They understood. In the Commonwealth warrior culture, where nobles prided themselves on dying well rather than living as cowards, this was enough. As midnight passed and dawn approached, both armies prepared for battle. One side confident in their superior tactics and firepower. The other side betting everything on speed, shock, and the willingness to die for a single desperate chance at victory. By noon tomorrow, one of them would be proven catastrophically wrong. Konstanty was gambling everything on one desperate charge. He was choosing honor over survival, shock over strategy. If you were facing his choice, impossible odds and the weight of a murdered brother, what would you have done? Drop your answer in the comments below. September 27, 1605, the hour before dawn. Swedish sentries on the forward picket lines stamped their feet against the cold, watching their breath form clouds in the pre-dawn darkness. Most had been on duty since midnight. 2 more hours until they'd be relieved. 2 more hours of watching an empty field where nothing moved except morning mist. Then one of them noticed something, movement at the tree line, perhaps a mile distant. Dark shapes emerging from the forest. Too many to be scouts, too organized to be deer or wildlife. The sentry called for his sergeant. The sergeant squinted into the gray light and saw what looked like horsemen forming up in ranks. He assumed it was a reconnaissance probe, maybe a light horseman feint designed to test Swedish positions. He sent a runner to alert the camp. Officers began waking their units. No urgency, just standard procedure. There was time. The Commonwealth horsemen were still far off. Swedish foot soldiers would form up. Cannons would be positioned. Defensive formations would be ready long before any attack could develop. Then the Commonwealth horsemen began to move. Not at a trot, not at a careful approach, at full gallop, immediately. The entire formation accelerating like a released crossbow bolt. 3,000 hussars in a wedge formation, lances leveled, striking directly at the Swedish center with no feints, no maneuvering, no tactical subtlety, just raw speed and concentrated mass aimed like a spear at the heart of Carlsson's army. Field Marshal Carlsson was still pulling on his armor in his command tent when he heard the rumbling. It sounded like distant thunder, but continuous, growing louder. He emerged from his tent and saw what was happening. Saw the entire Commonwealth horseman force charging across the field at speeds he hadn't thought possible for armored horsemen. He screamed orders. Form the tercio squares. Cannons to the front. Prepare volley fire now. Now. But it was too late for careful deployment. It was too late for systematic tactics. The hussars covered that mile in less than 4 minutes. Swedish foot soldiers, still scrambling up from night bivouac positions, had perhaps 90 seconds between realizing the attack was coming and the moment of impact. Some units managed to form hasty pike walls. Others were still grabbing weapons when the Commonwealth horsemen arrived. Cannon crews managed to fire one ragged volley. 8 guns out of 38 got shots off before the range closed. The cannonballs tore through the Commonwealth formation. One ball beheaded 3 horses in a single impact, their riders tumbling in sprays of blood. Another struck a hussar's chest, punching through his armor and out his back, the body toppling backward while the riderless horse continued forward. Dozens of hussars went down. Horses screamed and tumbled. Riders disappeared in explosions of earth and flesh. The charge didn't slow. Musket-armed foot soldiers in the Swedish front ranks formed hasty firing lines and pulled triggers without coordinating. Desperate men shooting at a rapidly approaching target. No time for the disciplined volley fire that made Swedish foot soldiers so deadly. More hussars fell. A musket ball struck Konstanty's horse in the shoulder, but the animal kept running. Another ball struck his breastplate and bounced off. The impact was like being kicked by a mule, but his armor held. The charge didn't slow. The sound of 3,000 hoofbeats at full gallop was like continuous thunder, a rumbling that drowned out shouted orders and screams and musket fire. The wings on some of the hussars created a rushing noise that mixed with the drumming hooves into something otherworldly, a sound Swedish soldiers had never heard before and would never forget. Swedish foot soldiers in the front ranks looked up from their hasty formations and saw an avalanche of armored horsemen bearing down on them. Unstoppable, terrible, moving faster than anything that size should move. Some stood their ground, bracing pikes and preparing to receive the charge with disciplined courage. Some ran, breaking from their formations and fleeing toward the rear. It didn't matter. The hussars arrived regardless. The hussar wedge hit the Swedish center tercio like a hammer striking glass. The lances, 15 feet of hollow wood tipped with steel, reached over and through the hastily formed pike wall. Riders leaning forward in their saddles, lances held under their arms, used the combined momentum of horse and rider and speed to drive the points through gaps in the pike hedge, through gaps in armor, through the bodies of men trying desperately to brace against the impact. The lances shattered on contact, hollow wood designed to break, transferring kinetic energy into the target rather than jolting back against the rider. But by then, each lance had already done its work. A Swedish pikeman bracing to receive the charge took a lance point through his chest. The lance shattered, the wooden shaft exploding into splinters, but the steel tip was already through his ribcage and out his back. He was dead before he hit the ground. Another soldier raised his pike to strike a charging hussar. The hussar's lance struck the pike shaft, shattering both weapons, but deflecting the Swedish pike upward. The horse crashed into the pikeman a heartbeat later, 1,500 pounds of muscle and momentum, trampling him into the mud. Then the main body of the horsemen arrived. War horses bred for aggression and trained to run directly into human formations crashed into the Swedish front ranks with the force of battering rams. Men went down under iron-shod hooves. Soldiers who tried to stand their ground were knocked aside or trampled. Pike formations designed to stop horsemen charges simply dissolved under the concentrated impact. Behind the lead rank of lancers came the second rank, sabers already pulled out and slashing at foot soldiers who were reeling from the initial shock. Then the third rank, then the fourth. The Swedish tercio, a formation designed to be nearly invulnerable to horseman attack, collapsed in sections. Gaps opened where men had been knocked down or killed. Soldiers broke formation and ran. Officers' screaming orders couldn't be heard over the chaos of combat and hoofbeats and screaming horses and dying men. Musketeers in the tercio center tried to reload for a second volley. They poured powder down barrels with shaking hands, rammed balls home, brought matchlocks to bear, and were ridden down before they could pull triggers. Sabers flashed, men fell. The interior of the tercio became a killing floor where Swedish soldiers with no room to maneuver died under horseman attacks coming from multiple directions. The wedge formation split the Swedish center completely, driving through the tercio like a spear through a target. Hussars emerged from the far side of the formation, wheeled their horses and charged back into the Swedish rear ranks, attacking units who were still facing forward, still trying to engage an enemy who was now behind them. Swedish discipline, the systematic tactical training that made them so formidable, became a liability. Units that tried to maintain formation while under attack from front and rear were trapped, unable to maneuver, cut down where they stood. Soldiers who followed training and held their positions died in formation. The ones who broke and ran at least had a chance. Konstanty Radziwiłł rode in the front rank of the charge, his lance shattering against a Swedish pike shaft seconds before impact. His saber cleared its sheath as his wounded horse plunged into the Swedish formation. There was no time for thought, only the momentum of the charge, the press of bodies, the mechanical action of striking at anything wearing Swedish colors. His horse took another pike thrust to its chest but continued forward on pure momentum and adrenaline. Konstanty cut down a Swedish officer trying to rally his men. He blocked a halberd swing. A musket ball passed so close to his head he felt its passage. His saddle was slick with blood, his horse's blood, enemy blood, possibly his own. There was no way to tell and no time to check. And then he was through, clear of the Swedish formation, emerging into open ground on the far side, wheeling his dying horse around to assess what his charge had accomplished. What Konstanty saw was complete tactical disintegration. The Swedish center had been shattered. 2 full tercios, 3,000 men each, were in full retreat, their formations broken, men running for the rear in scattered groups without officers or organization. Cannon pieces sat abandoned, their crews fled or dead. Bodies carpeted the ground where the tercio had stood, Swedish dead mixed with fallen horses and Commonwealth casualties. Foot soldier units on the Swedish wings, untouched by the charge, were trying to maneuver to provide support. But they moved slowly, ponderously, their officers struggling to adapt to a situation no drill had prepared them for. How do you pivot a 1,500-man tercio in the middle of battle? How do you maintain formation while watching your center collapse? Some Swedish commanders tried to form defensive squares. Others attempted to withdraw in good order. A few simply stood paralyzed, unable to process what they were witnessing. And Konstanty's hussars, bloodied, reduced, but still intact as a fighting force, were reforming for a second charge. Across the field, Commonwealth light horsemen that had waited in reserve now swept around the Swedish flanks. Lipka Tatars and Ukrainian Cossacks, mounted on fast-step ponies, attacked Swedish baggage trains and cut down fleeing soldiers. They moved like wolves through a flock, killing and looting and preventing any organized retreat. Swedish horsemen on the wings tried to counterattack. The armored reiters on the right wing formed up and charged at the nearest Commonwealth hussars to relieve pressure on the collapsing center. They were met by a reformed hussar squadron under Pan Ostrogski. The melee was brutal and short. Polish lances outreached Swedish sabers. Polish horses bred for the charge proved more aggressive than Swedish mounts. Within minutes, the Swedish horsemen counterattack broke, their survivors fleeing north with Commonwealth Cossacks in pursuit. Field Marshal Arvid Carlson, watching his carefully prepared battle plan disintegrate, attempted to salvage what he could. He gathered the units that remained intact, perhaps 5,000 foot soldiers from the wings and rear positions, and formed a defensive square. It was sound tactical thinking. A properly formed square could defend against horsemen from all directions. If the Commonwealth didn't respond to Lubeck, Karl would escalate, would keep pushing until the Commonwealth either submitted or was too weak to resist. The king looked at his counselors and saw their reasonable objections and careful calculations. Then he looked at Radziwiłł and saw something more important, the moral authority that comes from being willing to die for principle. On August 5, 1605, King Sigismund III formally declared that Duke Karl's occupation of Lubeck and execution of Commonwealth citizens constituted acts of war. Commonwealth armies would mobilize to liberate Swedish-occupied territories and restore legitimate authority over the contested Baltic provinces. Konstanty Radziwiłł was appointed Supreme Field Commander with authority to engage Swedish forces as he saw fit. Before Radziwiłł left Warsaw, Sigismund called him back for a private conversation in the royal study. No counselors, no clerks, no witnesses. The king poured 2 glasses of Hungarian wine and handed one to Konstanty. Hetman Radziwiłł, I am giving you this war because you have convinced me it is necessary. But I need you to promise me something. Anything, your majesty. Win, not just battles. Win decisively enough that Duke Karl understands the Commonwealth cannot be challenged with impunity. Because if you fail, if our armies are broken in the field, Sweden will not stop at the Baltic. They will push south into our heartland, and we will lack the strength to stop them. Sigismund's voice was steady, but his hands trembled slightly as he held his wine glass. The council is right about our resources. We cannot sustain a long war. We need a victory so complete that Karl sues for peace rather than escalation. Can you deliver that? Konstanty knelt and kissed the royal ring. I swear on my brother's grave and my family's honor, Sweden will learn what it costs to provoke the Commonwealth. It was a promise he would keep at a price so terrible that in his final years, Radziwiłł would wish he had broken that oath and let the injustice stand unanswered. The mobilization began immediately. Riders carried summons to noble estates across the Commonwealth, calling up horseman units. Each landed noble was required to provide mounted soldiers in proportion to the size of their holdings. This was how the Commonwealth raised armies, through feudal obligation rather than standing professional forces. By late August, horseman units were gathering at staging grounds near Riga. Hussars arrived from estates in Lithuania, Poland, and Ruthenia. Each squadron brought its own commanders, its own traditions, its own family pride. These were not professional soldiers serving for pay. These were nobles fighting for honor and obligation. Men whose grandfathers and great-grandfathers had ridden in these same formations. Konstanty inspected each unit personally. He knew many of these men, had fought beside their fathers, had attended their weddings, had stood godfather to their children. Now he was leading them into battle against an enemy with superior numbers and advanced tactics. He assembled his senior commanders and laid out the strategic situation with brutal honesty. Sweden has more soldiers, better cannons, and systematic training we cannot match. If we fight them conventionally, maneuvering for position, engaging in careful tactical chess, we will lose. Their foot soldiers are too disciplined. Their firepower is too concentrated. Our only advantage is the quality of our horsemen and the willingness to use it decisively. What does decisively mean, Hetman? Asked Ostrogsky, commander of the right wing. Radziwiłł met his eyes. It means when we find their army, we charge it immediately with everything we have. We break them before their advantages can show themselves, or we die trying. The commanders exchanged glances but said nothing. They understood what Radziwiłł was telling them. This would not be a careful campaign. This would be a single massive gamble. Everything on one throw of the dice. September 26, 1605. Late afternoon. Commonwealth scouts reported that a Swedish army under Field Marshal Arvid Carlsson had deployed in defensive positions near Kircholm, blocking the approach to Riga. The Swedish force numbered approximately 23,000, more than twice Konstanty's strength. Radziwiłł rode forward personally to observe the enemy deployment from a hidden position in the tree line, roughly a mile from the Swedish positions. What he saw confirmed his worst assumptions. The Swedish formation was textbook perfect. Infantry tercios formed the center, dense blocks of pikemen with musketeers in the core. Each tercio positioned to support its neighbors. Cannons were distributed along the front in batteries, creating overlapping fields of fire. Swedish horsemen protected the wings, positioned to counterattack or exploit opportunities. The ground favored the defender. Open field meant clear sight lines for cannons and musket fire. A small stream ran along one edge, not deep enough to stop movement, but enough to disorder horseman formations trying to cross. Low hills on the Swedish-held side provided slight elevation advantage. It was terrain chosen specifically to cancel out cavalry's mobility and expose attacking forces to concentrated firepower. His officers gathered around him as twilight deepened. Ostrogsky spoke what everyone was thinking. Hetman, we cannot attack that position head-on. We should withdraw, wait for our foot soldier reinforcements from Warsaw, and engage the Swedes when we have equal numbers. Konstanty continued studying the Swedish positions for a long moment before responding. If we withdraw, Karl will claim we fled before his superior forces. Every minor German prince with Baltic ambitions will interpret our retreat as weakness. And King Sigismund will wonder why he gave me this army if I refuse to use it. Better the king questions our courage than we sacrifice 3,000 hussars in a futile charge, another officer said. Radziwiłł turned to face his commanders directly. Tomorrow at dawn, we attack. Full charge, every hussar directly into their center. We will break through or die in the attempt. There is no third option. Ostrogsky stared at him. Hetman, with respect, that is not tactics. That is suicide. No, Radziwiłł replied, his voice cold and flat. Suicide is fighting a long war of attrition against a wealthier enemy with better supply lines. Suicide is letting Karl dictate the terms of engagement. Suicide is explaining to future generations why we had the finest horsemen in Europe and died without using them. He pulled out his saber, the same blade his grandfather had carried at Orsha. The Swedes expect us to fight like reasonable men, maneuvering, probing for weakness, engaging in careful tactical chess. they have deployed to counter reasonable tactics. So we will do something unreasonable. We will charge their center with every hussar before their cannons have time to aim properly. We will hit their foot soldier line at full gallop while they're still forming up from night positions. And we will break through before their firepower advantage can show itself. And if we don't break through? Ostrogski asked quietly. If their pikes hold and their muskets cut us down? Radzinski's expression was stone. Then we die well, and our deaths will at least teach the Swedes that the Commonwealth does not yield its honor for tactical caution. No one spoke. But the emptiness inside him was growing, and he was so tired. We hold here, secure the field, treat our wounded, bury our dead with proper honors. He paused, watching a Commonwealth soldier finish off a Swedish officer who had been begging for water. And execute the Swedish prisoners. Ostrogski's eyes widened. Hetman, all of them. We have 4,000 men in our custody, most of them wounded. All of them, Radzinski interrupted, his voice flat and cold. Karl executed our merchants without trial. We'll show his soldiers the same mercy he showed Mika. Maybe Duke Karl will understand that justice works both ways. Ostrogski opened his mouth to object, then closed it. He had known Konstanty for 15 years. He had never seen this expression on the hetman's face. Something harder than rage, colder than hatred, something that had moved beyond emotion into pure mechanical will. Hetman, executing prisoners of war violates every code of military honor. The Commonwealth prides itself on many things, Konstanty said, still not looking at Ostrogski. Justice, law, civilization. And where did that pride get us? It got 43 merchants hanged in a public square. It got our trade routes raided. It got Swedish troops occupying free cities and executing our citizens with impunity. He finally turned to meet Ostrogski's eyes. I promised the king I would win decisively enough that Sweden understands the Commonwealth cannot be challenged. Battlefield victory is not enough. Karl needs to understand that there are consequences. Real, personal, terrible consequences for murdering our people. This is not justice, Hetman. This is revenge. Perhaps, but revenge delivered decisively enough looks identical to deterrence. Give the order, Pan Ostrogski. Every Swedish prisoner is to be executed before nightfall. Ostrogski sat his horse in silence for a long moment. Then he nodded stiffly and rode off to relay the command. Word spread through the Commonwealth ranks quickly. Some soldiers received the order with grim satisfaction. These were men who had lost friends or family to Swedish raids, who had their own grievances to settle. Others were uncomfortable but obedient. Following orders was simpler than questioning them. A few officers objected privately, arguing to their commanders that this violated Christian principles of mercy and the military codes that separated civilized warfare from butchery. They were overruled. By mid-afternoon, the executions began. The Swedish prisoners were separated into groups based on their condition. Those who could walk were marched to a section of the field away from the main encampment. Those too wounded to walk were killed where they lay. Some prisoners begged for mercy in Swedish and German, languages most Commonwealth soldiers didn't understand or understood and chose to ignore. Some prisoners fought back, grabbing for weapons, attacking their captors with bare hands. They were killed quickly, swords through the chest or axes to the skull. Others prayed, Lutheran prayers in Swedish, Catholic prayers in German for mercenaries who had fought for Swedish pay. They were killed anyway. Officers were given no special consideration. A Swedish captain who demanded to speak to Commonwealth commanders about the rules of war was hanged from a supply wagon's crossbeam. A lieutenant who tried to negotiate ransom for himself and his men was shot in the head mid-sentence. The methods varied based on available resources and individual soldier preference. Some prisoners were hanged in groups from quickly built wooden structures used for hanging. Most were simply killed with whatever weapons the soldiers had nearby. Swords, axes, hammers, even rocks when nothing else could be found. There was no formal ceremony, no speeches about justice or getting back at enemies. Just organized, efficient killing done by men who had spent the morning doing the same work and saw the afternoon's job as just more of the same. Swedish prisoners who had watched the morning battle and seen their organized groups broken apart by impossible horse-soldier attacks now felt a different kind of fear. The fear of waiting for your turn. Of watching the men ahead of you in line get their throats cut, knowing you're next, unable to run or fight or do anything except wait for the blade. Some men broke mentally before they were actually killed. They screamed or cried or became completely still. Minds shutting down rather than face what was coming. The Commonwealth soldiers doing the executions worked with serious efficiency. This wasn't passionate violence. It was work. Unpleasant work, but work nonetheless. Kill this group of prisoners. Move to the next group. Repeat until the job is complete. By late afternoon, roughly half the prisoners were dead. By nightfall, it was finished. 4,000 Swedish soldiers executed in approximately 5 hours. Konstanty Radziwiłł watched the entire process from a distance, still sitting on his dying horse. When the last prisoner had been killed, he finally got down. His horse fell over the moment his weight left the saddle, falling onto its side, blood pooling around its chest. The animal had carried him through the charge, through the fighting, through hours of dying slowly, kept going by nothing except trained discipline and the absence of a rider's command to stop. Now released from service, it died within minutes. Konstanty knelt beside the horse and placed his hand on its neck until the breathing stopped. Then he stood, walked to a nearby stream, and washed the blood from his hands. He vomited into the stream until his stomach was empty. Then he vomited bile. Then he dry heaved, his body trying to get rid of something that couldn't be removed through physical means. When he finally stopped, he remained kneeling by the stream, staring at his reflection in the water. The face looking back at him was his own. Same features, same eyes. But something behind the eyes had changed. Something had been killed along with those 4,000 Swedish soldiers. Some part of himself that believed in honor and justice and the righteousness of his cause. He had won the greatest horse-soldier victory in modern European history. He had kept his promise to Sigismund. He had gotten revenge for his brother's murder, and he had become exactly the kind of monster he had sworn to punish. News of Kircholm reached Warsaw on October 6, 1605, carried by riders who had killed 3 horses each in their urgency to deliver the message. King Sigismund III received the initial report in his private chambers. Swedish army destroyed. Baltic provinces secured. Commonwealth casualties minimal. Decisive victory beyond anything hoped for. The king cried, not from joy, but from relief so overwhelming it showed up as physical release. For weeks he had lived with the terror that Radziwiłł's gamble would fail, that the Commonwealth's finest horse soldiers would be destroyed, that Swedish armies would pour south with nothing to stop them. Instead, within hours, the entire city knew. Church bells rang across Warsaw. Songs of praise were sung in every chapel and cathedral. Bonfires were lit in the market squares. The Commonwealth nobility, who had privately questioned whether fighting Sweden was wise, now celebrated Radziwiłł as the greatest military commander since the legendary John Sobieski. The initial excitement lasted approximately 3 days. Then the detailed reports arrived. Not just the dry military accounting of casualties and captured equipment, but eyewitness descriptions from officers who had been present. Descriptions that included the systematic execution of 4,000 prisoners over the course of an afternoon and evening. The celebrations became more quiet, more complicated. The Commonwealth prided itself on being a nation of laws and religious tolerance where even enemies received justice according to established rules. The systematic killing of captured soldiers, most of them wounded, all of them defenseless, violated every principle of Christian warfare and military honor. King Sigismund summoned his royal council to discuss what should be done. The meeting lasted 7 hours and achieved nothing resembling agreement. Chancellor Zamoyski argued that Radziwiłł should be formally criticized, possibly even charged with violating military law. We cannot celebrate a victory achieved through methods that make us no different from the barbarians we claim to oppose. Bishop Machowski countered that Swedish cruelties at Lübeck had set the example. Duke Karl executed our merchants without trial. If we punish Radziwiłł for responding the same way, we send the message that Commonwealth blood is cheaper than Swedish blood. Other councillors pointed out the political realities. Radziwiłł had delivered exactly what the king demanded. A victory so decisive that Sweden would think twice before challenging the Commonwealth again. Punishing him now would discourage the army and suggest that the king didn't support his own commanders. The debate circled for hours without resolution. Finally, Sigismund made a decision that satisfied no one but avoided the worst outcomes. Radziwiłł would be neither condemned nor officially celebrated. The victory at Kircholm would be praised as a triumph of Commonwealth arms and military skill. The execution of prisoners would be quietly left out from official accounts, mentioned only indirectly in private correspondence, if at all. It was political calculation disguised as measured judgment. The practical effect was that the moral stain of Kircholm attached to Radziwiłł personally without official punishment that might discourage future Swedish aggression, but also without official forgiveness that might have eased his conscience. He had won the battle, he had kept his promise, and he would carry the weight of those 4,000 deaths alone. Konstanty returned to Warsaw in late October, expecting either celebration or condemnation. What he received was worse. Polite congratulations shadowed by uncomfortable silence about what had actually happened. The king granted him a private audience on October 28 in the royal study with no councillors or witnesses present. Sigismund embraced Radziwiłł formally, thanked him for his extraordinary service, praised his tactical brilliance. All the proper words, all delivered with genuine gratitude. Then the king poured 2 glasses of wine, handed one to Konstanty, and said what he actually needed to say. You kept your promise, Hetman. You won decisively. Sweden now understands that the Commonwealth cannot be challenged without consequences. He paused, studying the wine in his glass. But I wonder, did the victory require quite so much blood? Konstanty met the king's eyes and saw the truth there. Sigismund was grateful for the military triumph and disgusted by the methods. The king wanted the benefits of Kircholm without bearing responsibility for how those benefits were achieved. Your Majesty, when you gave me this command, you told me to win decisively enough that Duke Karl would understand the stakes. I have done exactly that. If my methods disturb you, perhaps you should have chosen a different commander. Perhaps you should have chosen someone capable of defeating 23,000 Swedish troops through tactics that satisfy both military necessity and moral philosophy. It was as close to insubordination as Radziwiłł had ever come. Sigismund's face tightened, his grip on the wine glass increasing until his knuckles went white. But he said nothing because both men understood the essential truth. The king had wanted this outcome, had needed this outcome, even if he preferred not to examine the process too closely. The audience ended with formal courtesies and mutual discomfort. No award was issued. No criticism was recorded. Konstanty's service was acknowledged and then quietly set aside like a tool that had performed its function, but was too ugly to display. Radziwiłł left the royal palace understanding that he would exist in a permanent state of official uncertainty. Neither hero nor criminal, neither honored nor punished. He had won the battle and lost something more valuable, the certainty that his cause had been right and his actions justified. Konstanty requested extended leave from military service and retired to his family estates in the Eastern Commonwealth near the frontier with Muscovy. He told himself he needed rest, that watching his brother's murderers pay for their crimes had brought closure. That time away from military service would restore his balance. He was wrong on every count. The nightmares began within a week of his return home. He would dream of Swedish soldiers begging for mercy in languages he didn't understand. He would dream of his brother hanging from a gallows, but when he looked closer, the face was his own. He would dream of the stream at Kircholm running red with blood that wouldn't wash away. No matter how many times he put his hands into the water. He woke screaming often enough that his wife Sophia moved to separate chambers. His children, 2 sons and a daughter, began avoiding him, frightened by the distant stranger their father had become. Konstanty tried to drink himself to sleep. It didn't work. The alcohol just made the dreams more vivid, the guilt more crushing. He stopped attending Mass. When his wife asked why, he told her the truth. I cannot face a priest for confession. What would I confess? That I won? That I kept my promise to the king? That I murdered 4,000 helpless men and felt justified doing it? Sophia tried to comfort him, tried to tell him he had done what was necessary, that war required terrible choices, that God would understand. He pushed her away. You weren't there. You didn't see what I did, what I became. His estate managers reported that the hetman would spend entire nights walking the halls, talking to himself or to ghosts they couldn't see. Servants heard him arguing with invisible opponents, his voice rising in anger and then breaking into something like sobs. During the day, Konstanty locked himself in his study and began writing. Page after page of tactical analysis, trying to understand how the battle had unfolded, what decisions had led to what outcomes. Maps covered every surface. Troop movements were drawn and redrawn. He was trying to find the moment where he could have made a different choice, the decision point where victory could have been achieved without becoming the monster who ordered 4,000 executions. He never found it because that decision point didn't exist. The victory and the cruelty were inseparable. Two sides of the same coin that he had willingly accepted when he made his promise to Sigismund. The news of Kircholm reached Duke Karl on October 7, 1605. The messenger who delivered it was a horse soldier lieutenant who had escaped the battle, riding for 6 days with minimal rest to bring word of the disaster. Karl listened to the report in his private chambers at Stockholm Castle. 23,000 soldiers deployed, 9,000 killed in battle, 4,000 executed as prisoners, 6,000 scattered in retreat. Most without weapons or equipment. The entire professional army effectively destroyed. When the lieutenant finished his report, Karl drew his pistol and shot him in the chest. The messenger collapsed, blood spreading across the fine carpet. He tried to speak to ask why, but only a wet gurgling came out. He died within minutes while Karl stood over him, the smoking pistol still in his hand. It was neither rational nor just. It was the action of a man who needed to kill someone, anyone, in response to news that shattered his understanding of Swedish military superiority. Servants were summoned to remove the body. The corpse was dumped in an unmarked grave outside the city walls, the same fate Karl had ordered for the Lübeck merchants, though he never made that connection. Karl spent the next 3 days in his chambers, seeing no one, speaking to no one. His counselors waited nervously outside, uncertain whether to disturb him or give him space to process the disaster. When Karl finally came out, his fury had transformed into something more dangerous. Cold strategic calculation focused on a single objective. If he couldn't defeat the Commonwealth militarily, at least not immediately, he would destroy them through every other means available. Economic warfare, diplomatic isolation, systematic terror. The Commonwealth had won the battle. Karl would ensure they lost everything else. Over the 6 months following Kircholm, Duke Karl unleashed what Swedish records called commercial adjustment measures, and what Commonwealth sources described as the Baltic devastation. Every Commonwealth merchant ship operating in Swedish-controlled waters was seized. Cargoes were taken. Ships were either made part of the Swedish Navy or burned. Crews were imprisoned or expelled. Within weeks, Commonwealth sea trade through the Baltic had effectively stopped. Grain shipments from Gdansk to Western European markets, one of the Commonwealth's most vital trade routes, were blocked by Swedish pirates operating under licenses from Karl's government. Ships that tried to run the blockade were sunk. Insurance rates for Commonwealth vessels became too expensive. Foreign merchants stopped contracting for Commonwealth grain because they couldn't guarantee delivery. The economic impact rippled through the Commonwealth social structure. Noble estates in Poland and Ukraine depended on grain exports for their cash income. When those markets disappeared, estate revenues collapsed. Nobles who had borrowed against future harvests found themselves unable to pay their debts. Land was sold at distressed prices. Families that had held estates for generations faced bankruptcy. Rural populations suffered worse. With grain prices collapsing due to inability to reach foreign markets, peasants couldn't earn enough from their harvests to pay taxes calculated in silver. Tax collection became increasingly difficult. And when taxes couldn't be collected voluntarily, they were taken through force. Royal officials accompanied by soldiers seized crops, livestock, and property. In Riga, the major Baltic port that had been secured by Commonwealth forces after Kircholm, warehouses filled with goods that couldn't be shipped. Timber rotted on the docks. Amber sat in storage while merchants who had purchased it on credit faced ruin because they couldn't transport it to markets. Swedish forces raided the Riga warehouses in January 1606, striking at night with ships that landed troops directly on the waterfront. They burned what they couldn't carry away. 3 months of stored trade goods, representing the winter income for hundreds of Commonwealth merchants, went up in flames. Karl's economic warfare extended beyond simple blockade. Swedish agents operating in neutral territories like Hamburg and Lübeck spread rumors about Commonwealth financial instability. They claimed that the execution of prisoners at Kircholm demonstrated lawlessness that made the Commonwealth an unreliable trading partner. They suggested that Commonwealth nobles were so in debt they might default on contracts. The rumors had just enough truth to be believable. Foreign merchants began demanding payment in advance rather than extending credit. Interest rates on Commonwealth loans increased. Investment capital that might have flowed east to Polish estates instead went elsewhere. The Commonwealth's economy, already strained by ongoing wars with the Ottomans, began to buckle under the pressure. Tax revenues declined as trade collapsed. The royal treasury couldn't fund military operations at necessary levels. Soldiers went unpaid, which led to desertions and mutinies. King Sigismund's government tried to respond with counter-blockades and trade restrictions. But the Commonwealth lacked Sweden's naval power and centralized authority. Swedish economic warfare was coordinated and systematic. Commonwealth responses were broken up and ineffective. By spring 1606, the economic cost of Kircholm's victory was becoming clear. The Commonwealth had won a battle and started an economic war it was losing badly. While strangling Commonwealth trade, Karl simultaneously launched a diplomatic offensive throughout northern Europe designed to isolate Poland-Lithuania politically and morally. Swedish envoys traveled to Protestant courts in Germany, Denmark, England, and the Netherlands carrying the same message. The Commonwealth had violated all norms of civilized warfare by executing 4,000 prisoners at Kircholm. Poland-Lithuania was a lawless state ruled by Catholic fanatics who couldn't be trusted to honor military conventions or diplomatic agreements. The propaganda was effective precisely because it was true. The executions had happened. Commonwealth officials couldn't deny them, only tried to justify them by citing Swedish cruelties at Lübeck. But Karl's envoys had prepared responses to that argument. They claimed the Lübeck executions were legitimate punishments for spying and treason carried out after proper investigation. They presented fake documents proving that the executed merchants had been plotting against Swedish interests. They transformed a massacre into judicial proceedings. Protestant audiences throughout Northern Europe were predisposed to believe Swedish accounts over Catholic Commonwealth versions. Religious solidarity mattered more than factual accuracy. In Denmark, King Christian IV, who might have supported the Commonwealth against Swedish expansion, instead declared strict neutrality and prohibited Danish ships from carrying Commonwealth goods. He couldn't afford to alienate Protestant opinion by supporting a Catholic power accused of war crimes. In England, King James I received Swedish envoys warmly and Commonwealth representatives coolly. English merchants who had been considering trade agreements with Poland-Lithuania backed away, unwilling to risk association with a nation painted as barbaric. In the German Protestant states, princes who controlled critical trade routes through Central Europe imposed restrictions on Commonwealth merchants while granting preferential treatment to Swedish trade. The diplomatic isolation compounded the economic warfare. The Commonwealth needed foreign allies to offset Swedish naval superiority and access to Western markets. Instead, it found itself increasingly alone, painted as a Catholic aggressor violating the rules of civilized conflict. Sigismund's government attempted counter-propaganda, sending envoys throughout Europe to explain the context of Kircholm and Swedish provocations that preceded it. But Commonwealth diplomats were playing defense, trying to justify actions that looked indefensible on their surface, while Swedish envoys controlled the narrative. The execution of those 4,000 prisoners, the decision Radziwiłł made in a moment of grief-fueled rage, had become a diplomatic catastrophe that undermined everything the military victory had achieved. The most devastating component of Karl's response was a systematic campaign of terror against Commonwealth civilians in contested border regions. Swedish forces didn't attempt to recapture territory through conventional military operations. Kircholm had demonstrated the dangers of that approach. Instead, they launched raids designed to destroy Commonwealth economic capacity and turn civilian populations against their own government. Villages suspected of providing supplies to Commonwealth forces were burned. Not just military targets, but entire communities. Soldiers would surround a village at dawn, round up the population, take anything of value, then set every building on fire. Villagers who resisted were killed. Those who cooperated were left homeless with winter approaching. Civilians were executed in calculated ratios as retaliation for Swedish military losses. Karl's explicit policy communicated to his commanders in writing was 10 Commonwealth peasants killed for every Swedish soldier who died at Kircholm. 9,000 Swedish dead meant 90,000 Commonwealth civilians were to be targeted. The policy wasn't fully implemented. Swedish forces lacked the capacity to kill 90,000 people systematically, but they tried. Contemporary accounts document massacre after massacre throughout late 1605 and 1606. In the town of Regiment, Swedish forces herded 340 civilians into the town's wooden church, barred the doors from outside, and set the building on fire. Those who tried to escape through windows were shot or pushed back into the flames. The entire population burned alive while Swedish soldiers stood guard to ensure no one escaped. In Valka, Swedish raiders systematically destroyed every building in the town over 3 days. Anything that could burn was burned. Stone structures were torn down. Wells were filled with debris and animal corpses to contaminate the water supply. The entire town was erased from existence. The cruelties followed predictable patterns. Swedish forces would strike at dawn when resistance was minimal. They would separate men from women and children. Fighting-age males would be executed immediately, hung from trees, shot, or simply cut down with swords. Women and children would be driven from their homes, which were then looted and burned. Some women were raped before being killed or expelled. Children were sometimes taken as forced labor, transported to Swedish territories, and sold to estate owners who needed workers. Most were simply driven into the wilderness with winter approaching, left to starve or freeze. Entire border regions were emptied of people. Refugees flooded south into Commonwealth heartland, overwhelming urban infrastructure and spreading disease. Every refugee was a person who couldn't farm, couldn't pay taxes, couldn't contribute to the war effort. They were economic and social burdens that strained the Commonwealth's capacity to function. Commonwealth military forces couldn't defend everywhere. Swedish raiders operated in small, mobile groups, striking quickly, killing or destroying what they could, then withdrawing before Commonwealth horse soldiers could respond. By the time defenders arrived, the raiders were gone and the village was already ashes and corpses. The psychological impact was devastating. Commonwealth peasants began questioning whether their government could protect them. Some villages negotiated private truces with Swedish raiders, agreeing not to support Commonwealth forces in exchange for being spared. Local collaboration networks emerged, undermining the Commonwealth's authority in its own territories. By spring 1606, a limited war over Baltic trade had grown into total conflict. Two nations viewed each other with absolute hatred, each convinced of the other's barbarism, each committed to the other's destruction. The war Konstanty Radziwiłł thought he had won at Kircholm was actually just beginning. By 1608, 3 years after Kircholm, the Commonwealth was fighting 3 simultaneous wars it couldn't win. In the north, Swedish raiders continued their terror campaign, while Swedish naval forces maintained the Baltic blockade. Commonwealth armies controlled territory, but couldn't project power. Every attempt to invade Swedish-held Livonia met fierce resistance, and the victories that were achieved came at costs the Commonwealth couldn't sustain. In the south, the Ottoman Empire sensed weakness and renewed pressure along the frontier. Tatar raiders from the Crimean Khanate, Ottoman vassals, swept into Ukrainian territories, seizing slaves and livestock, burning settlements. Commonwealth forces that might have defended the southern frontier were tied down fighting Swedes in the north. Most dangerously, internal rebellions erupted across the Commonwealth. The economic chaos created by Swedish blockades, the tax increases needed to fund military operations, and the government's inability to protect civilian populations from Swedish terror raids all fueled popular discontent. In 1606, a minor noble named Mikołaj Zebrzydowski raised the Rebellion of Zebrzydowski, a revolt of nobles who claimed King Sigismund had exceeded his constitutional authority by dragging the Commonwealth into an unnecessary war with Sweden. The rebellion attracted supporters throughout Poland and Lithuania. Nobles who had seen their estates raided, their trade revenues collapse, and their obligations to the crown multiply while royal protection disappeared. The Commonwealth's political structure made coherent strategy impossible. The parliament where nobles held veto power over royal decisions, fractured into factions. Some demanded total war against Sweden regardless of cost. Others advocated immediate peace negotiations. Still others pursued their own regional interests without regard for national policy. King Sigismund couldn't raise taxes without Sejm approval. He couldn't conclude peace treaties without noble consent. He couldn't implement military reforms because they threatened noble prerogatives. The treasury was effectively bankrupt. Soldiers went months without pay. Units deserted or mutinied, sometimes selling their services to the highest bidder, regardless of nationality. The Commonwealth's military, which had achieved one of history's greatest horse-soldier victories just 3 years earlier, was dissolving through neglect and lack of resources. Meanwhile, Duke Karl maintained pressure, knowing time favored Sweden. He didn't need to win battles. He just needed to ensure the Commonwealth consumed itself through internal contradictions and resource exhaustion. The terrible irony of Kircholm was that the Commonwealth's brilliant tactical victory led directly to strategic disaster. The battle had destroyed Sweden's invasion force, demonstrating that Commonwealth horse soldiers could defeat any army foolish enough to engage them in favorable terrain. But it had also provoked total Swedish commitment to the conflict and made international a war that might have remained limited. Konstanty Radziwiłł had promised King Sigismund a victory so decisive that Sweden would sue for peace. Instead, Kircholm had the opposite effect, convincing Karl that conventional military operations wouldn't work, pushing him toward economic warfare, terror campaigns, and diplomatic isolation that the Commonwealth couldn't counter effectively. If the Commonwealth had lost at Kircholm, Sweden might have seized the Baltic provinces and negotiated a settlement. Instead, the Commonwealth won so thoroughly that it backed Sweden into a corner where the only options were total commitment or humiliating surrender. Karl chose total commitment. And Sweden's more centralized government, Protestant alliances, and control of Baltic trade routes gave it advantages in sustained conflict that the Commonwealth's political structure couldn't match. The Commonwealth could win battles, but couldn't win the war. Each tactical victory cost resources that couldn't be replaced. Sweden could absorb losses, rebuild its armies, and return because Swedish tax collection was efficient, Swedish trade routes were secure, and Swedish government could make decisions without consulting argumentative nobles. By 1609, the strategic situation was clear to anyone willing to see it. The Commonwealth was exhausted, divided, and facing enemies on 3 fronts. The only question was whether Sigismund's government would acknowledge reality and negotiate peace or continue fighting until complete collapse forced even worse terms. Swedish diplomats began making quiet approaches to Commonwealth representatives, suggesting that negotiations might be possible if proper conditions were met. The message was clear. End the war now on moderately unfavorable terms or continue fighting until the terms become catastrophic. Negotiations began in earnest in 1610, mediated by French diplomats who had their own interests in limiting Swedish power but weren't willing to directly support the Commonwealth militarily. The talks were conducted in the small Swedish town of Linköping, chosen specifically because it was Swedish territory, forcing Commonwealth negotiators to travel to enemy ground, a symbolic subordination that set the tone for everything that followed. King Sigismund didn't attend personally. That duty fell to Chancellor Zamoyski and a delegation of senior nobles who understood they were negotiating from weakness. Swedish demands were comprehensive. The Commonwealth would recognize Swedish control over all contested Baltic territories, abandoning claims that Sigismund had maintained since 1598. This meant formally giving to Karl regions that belonged to Sigismund by legitimate inheritance. Sigismund would give up all claims to the Swedish throne, acknowledging Karl as the legitimate ruler of Sweden despite the coup and takeover. Everything Sigismund had fought to preserve, his legitimate succession rights, would be surrendered. The Commonwealth would pay war reparations totaling 300,000 silver thalers, compensating Sweden for military expenses and damages caused by Commonwealth aggression. This despite the fact that Sweden had started the conflict by executing Commonwealth merchants. Trade agreements would be renegotiated heavily in Sweden's favor with reduced tariffs on Swedish goods entering Commonwealth markets and increased restrictions on Commonwealth merchants operating in Swedish territories. Finally, most humiliatingly, the treaty required the Commonwealth to officially condemn the execution of Swedish prisoners at Kircholm as a violation of military law with a formal apology issued on behalf of the Commonwealth government. This last provision was purely symbolic, designed to extract maximum humiliation. It served no practical purpose except to force the Commonwealth to publicly acknowledge that its greatest military victory was also a war crime. Chancellor Zamoyski read through the terms and understood what they represented. Strategic defeat despite tactical brilliance. 5 years of war had achieved nothing except exhausting the Commonwealth and strengthening Swedish position. He had authority to refuse the terms and continue fighting. He also had intelligence reports describing the Commonwealth's actual military capacity. Depleted treasury, rebellious soldiers, three-front war, internal rebellions, and no prospect of foreign assistance. On November 30, 1610, the Treaty of Linkoping was signed. The Commonwealth had won the Battle of Kircholm and lost the war. Konstanty Radziwiłł received news of the treaty in his study at his eastern estates on December 8, 1610. The messenger was a young officer who had served under him at Kircholm, now delivering dispatches as part of his routine duties. He handed Konstanty the sealed document containing the treaty terms and waited for instructions. Konstanty broke the seal and read silently. The officer watched the hetman's face, expecting anger or grief or some visible reaction. Instead, Konstanty's expression remained completely neutral. He read through the entire treaty, every article, every provision, every humiliating concession with the same detached focus he might apply to a grain inventory or estate accounts. When he finished, he set the document on his desk and looked at the young officer. "You were at Kircholm. You charged with the 3rd Squadron of Hussars." "Yes, Hetman. We won that day. Destroyed a Swedish army twice our size. The greatest horse-soldier victory in living memory." "Yes, Hetman." Konstanty gestured at the treaty document. "And this is what we won. Territory given up. Claims abandoned. Reparations paid. Apologies issued for the crime of defending ourselves too effectively." The young officer said nothing, uncertain how to respond. "Tell me," Konstanty asked, his voice quiet and empty. "Was it worth it? 9,000 Swedish soldiers killed, 4,000 prisoners executed, 400 of our finest horse soldiers dead. For this." The officer opened his mouth, then closed it. There was no good answer. Konstanty dismissed him with a gesture. After the officer left, Konstanty remained at his desk, staring at the treaty terms. He had sworn on his brother's grave that Sweden would learn what it cost to provoke the Commonwealth. He had kept that promise. He had delivered the decisive victory King Sigismund demanded. And the final result was a treaty that recognized Swedish dominance, economic concessions favoring the enemy, and formal acknowledgement that the Commonwealth's military triumph was legally and morally indefensible. He sat alone in his study until the candles burned down and darkness filled the room. Konstanty Radziwiłł spent his remaining years isolated on his estates, rarely traveling beyond his own lands, avoiding contact with the royal court and former military colleagues. The Commonwealth's military, which had achieved one of history's greatest horse-soldier victories just 3 years earlier, was dissolving through neglect and lack of resources. Meanwhile, Duke Karl maintained pressure, knowing time favored Sweden. He didn't need to win battles. He just needed to ensure the Commonwealth consumed itself through internal contradictions and resource exhaustion. The terrible irony of Kircholm was that the Commonwealth's brilliant tactical victory led directly to strategic disaster. The battle had destroyed Sweden's invasion force, demonstrating that Commonwealth horse soldiers could defeat any army foolish enough to engage them in favorable terrain. But it had also provoked total Swedish commitment to the conflict and made international a war that might have remained limited. Konstanty Radziwiłł had promised King Sigismund a victory so decisive that Sweden would sue for peace. Instead, Kircholm had the opposite effect, convincing Karl that conventional military operations wouldn't work, pushing him toward economic warfare, terror campaigns, and diplomatic isolation that the Commonwealth couldn't counter effectively. If the Commonwealth had lost at Kircholm, Sweden might have seized the Baltic provinces and negotiated a settlement. Instead, the Commonwealth won so thoroughly that it backed Sweden into a corner where the only options were total commitment or humiliating surrender. Karl chose total commitment. And Sweden's more centralized government, Protestant alliances, and control of Baltic trade routes gave it advantages in sustained conflict that the Commonwealth's political structure couldn't match. The Commonwealth could win battles, but couldn't win the war. Each tactical victory cost resources that couldn't be replaced. Sweden could absorb losses, rebuild its armies, and return because Swedish tax collection was efficient, Swedish trade routes were secure, and Swedish government could make decisions without consulting argumentative nobles. By 1609, the strategic situation was clear to anyone willing to see it. The Commonwealth was exhausted, divided, and facing enemies on three fronts. The only question was whether Sigismund's government would acknowledge reality and negotiate peace or continue fighting until complete collapse forced even worse terms. Swedish diplomats began making quiet approaches to Commonwealth representatives, suggesting that negotiations might be possible if proper conditions were met. The message was clear. End the war now on moderately unfavorable terms or continue fighting until the terms become catastrophic. Negotiations began in earnest in 1610, mediated by French diplomats who had their own interests in limiting Swedish power but weren't willing to directly support the Commonwealth militarily. The talks were conducted in the small Swedish town of Linköping, chosen specifically because it was Swedish territory, forcing Commonwealth negotiators to travel to enemy ground, a symbolic subordination that set the tone for everything that followed. King Sigismund didn't attend personally. That duty fell to Chancellor Zamoyski and a delegation of senior nobles who understood they were negotiating from weakness. Swedish demands were comprehensive. The Commonwealth would recognize Swedish control over all contested Baltic territories, abandoning claims that Sigismund had maintained since 1598. This meant formally giving to Karl regions that belonged to Sigismund by legitimate inheritance. Sigismund would give up all claims to the Swedish throne, acknowledging Karl as the legitimate ruler of Sweden despite the coup and takeover. Everything Sigismund had fought to preserve, his legitimate succession rights, would be surrendered. The Commonwealth would pay war reparations totaling 300,000 silver thalers, compensating Sweden for military expenses and damages caused by Commonwealth aggression. This despite the fact that Sweden had started the conflict by executing Commonwealth merchants. Trade agreements would be renegotiated heavily in Sweden's favor with reduced tariffs on Swedish goods entering Commonwealth markets and increased restrictions on Commonwealth merchants operating in Swedish territories. Finally, most humiliatingly, the treaty required the Commonwealth to officially condemn the execution of Swedish prisoners at Kircholm as a violation of military law with a formal apology issued on behalf of the Commonwealth government. This last provision was purely symbolic, designed to extract maximum humiliation. It served no practical purpose except to force the Commonwealth to publicly acknowledge that its greatest military victory was also a war crime. Chancellor Zamoyski read through the terms and understood what they represented. Strategic defeat despite tactical brilliance. 5 years of war had achieved nothing except exhausting the Commonwealth and strengthening Swedish position. He had authority to refuse the terms and continue fighting. He also had intelligence reports describing the Commonwealth's actual military capacity. Depleted treasury, rebellious soldiers, three-front war, internal rebellions, and no prospect of foreign assistance. On November 30, 1610, the Treaty of Linköping was signed. The Commonwealth had won the Battle of Kircholm and lost the war. Konstanty Radziwiłł received news of the treaty in his study at his eastern estates on December 8, 1610. The messenger was a young officer who had served under him at Kircholm, now delivering dispatches as part of his routine duties. He handed Konstanty the sealed document containing the treaty terms and waited for instructions. Konstanty broke the seal and read silently. The officer watched the hetman's face, expecting anger or grief or some visible reaction. Instead, Konstanty's expression remained completely neutral. He read through the entire treaty, every article, every provision, every humiliating concession with the same detached focus he might apply to a grain inventory or estate accounts. When he finished, he set the document on his desk and looked at the young officer. "You were at Kircholm. You charged with the 3rd Squadron of Hussars." "Yes, Hetman. We won that day. Destroyed a Swedish army twice our size. The greatest horse-soldier victory in living memory." "Yes, Hetman." Konstanty gestured at the treaty document. "And this is what we won. Territory given up. Claims abandoned. Reparations paid. Apologies issued for the crime of defending ourselves too effectively." The young officer said nothing, uncertain how to respond. "Tell me," Konstanty asked, his voice quiet and empty. "Was it worth it? 9,000 Swedish soldiers killed, 4,000 prisoners executed, 400 of our finest horse soldiers dead. For this." The officer opened his mouth, then closed it. There was no good answer. Konstanty dismissed him with a gesture. After the officer left, Konstanty remained at his desk, staring at the treaty terms. He had sworn on his brother's grave that Sweden would learn what it cost to provoke the Commonwealth. He had kept that promise. He had delivered the decisive victory King Sigismund demanded. And the final result was a treaty that recognized Swedish dominance, economic concessions favoring the enemy, and formal acknowledgement that the Commonwealth's military triumph was legally and morally indefensible. He sat alone in his study until the candles burned down and darkness filled the room. Konstanty Radziwiłł spent his remaining years isolated on his estates, rarely traveling beyond his own lands, avoiding contact with the royal court and former military colleagues. His family life had collapsed completely. His wife Sophia maintained separate residence in a different wing of the estate, seeing her husband only at formal occasions. His children visited dutifully, but briefly, uncomfortable with the silent stranger their father had become. Konstanty's days followed rigid routine. He woke before dawn, walked the estate grounds regardless of weather, then locked himself in his study until midday. He took meals alone. In the afternoon, he would walk again, sometimes for hours, servants reporting that he often spoke aloud to himself or to invisible companions. The study became his entire world. Maps of the Kircholm battlefield covered every wall. Tactical diagrams were scattered across tables. He had put together a comprehensive analysis of the battle, troop movements, timing, decision points, outcomes. The manuscript ran to hundreds of pages written in his increasingly erratic handwriting. He was trying to find the moment where he could have made a different choice. The decision point where victory could have been achieved without the executions, without the brutality, without becoming the monster that haunted his nightmares. He never found it because that moment didn't exist. The victory and the cruelty were inseparable. The decisive triumph King Sigismund demanded required tactics so shocking, so brutal that they provoked Swedish total commitment rather than surrender. The same rage that drove Konstanty to order the executions was the emotional fuel that sustained him through the impossible horse-soldier charge. You couldn't have one without the other. In 1614, estate servants noticed that Konstanty had stopped eating properly. His clothing hung loose on a frame that had lost significant weight. His hair had gone entirely gray. He was 53 years old, but looked 20 years older. On the night of March 17, 1614, Konstanty worked late in his study as usual. Servants heard him pacing, heard papers rustling, heard his voice raised in what sounded like argument with someone who wasn't there. Sometime before dawn, the sound stopped. In the morning, servants found him slumped over his desk, which was covered with maps of Kircholm. A quill pen was still in his hand. The candles had burned down to stubs. The estate physician determined he had died in his sleep, probably from heart failure. Whether the heart failed from physical or spiritual causes, the physician couldn't say. After Konstanty's death, his family discovered his journal in a locked drawer of the desk where he died. The final entry was dated March 17, 1614, the day of his death. The handwriting was shakier than earlier entries, but the words were clear. We won at Kircholm because we were desperate enough to attempt the impossible and skilled enough to succeed. I charged 23,000 Swedish troops with 9,000 horse soldiers because conventional tactics meant certain defeat. I executed 4,000 prisoners because rage and grief demanded blood for blood. And we lost the war because I believed that winning battles was the same as achieving victory. I killed 9,000 Swedes at Kircholm and murdered 4,000 more after they surrendered. I kept my promise to Sigismund. I got revenge for my brother's execution. I demonstrated that the Commonwealth could not be challenged without consequences. And I gained nothing. Not justice, not security, not even satisfaction. The Swedes we killed were replaced. The territories we defended were given up. The honor we claimed to uphold was stained by methods that violated everything we supposedly valued. If I could speak to my younger self in the Treeline that night before the battle, I would say this: walk away. Let the injustice stand. Some debts of honor cost more to collect than they are worth. But I cannot speak to that younger man. He is dead. Killed not at Kircholm, but in the days after, when he discovered that vengeance brings no peace and victory solves nothing. All that remains is this older man counting corpses and measuring the distance between what I intended and what I achieved. The distance is infinite. The entry ended there. Below it, Konstanty had sketched one final diagram of the Kircholm battlefield. The horse-soldier formations drawn in careful detail one last time. The final accounting of Kircholm and the war that followed is written in blood across northern European history. 9,000 Swedish soldiers killed in the battle itself. 4,000 prisoners executed in its aftermath. 400 Commonwealth dead on the field. Another 300 who died later from wounds. Then the 5 years of warfare that followed. Thousands more killed in raids and fights. Entire villages massacred in Swedish terror campaigns. Commonwealth civilians numbering in the tens of thousands dead from violence or starvation or exposure after their homes were burned. Economic devastation measured in ruined estates, bankrupted merchants, disrupted trade routes that took decades to rebuild. Political consequences that weakened the Commonwealth's ability to respond to future threats, contributing to the nation's eventual partition and disappearance from the map by the end of the 18th century. All of it flowing from a single decision made in grief and rage by a man who thought honor demanded blood for blood. Konstanty Radziwiłł wanted justice for his brother. He wanted punishment for Swedish aggression. He wanted proof that the Commonwealth could not be bullied by a stronger power. He achieved all of that at Kircholm and discovered that achieving what you want doesn't mean gaining what you need. The questions Radziwiłł was actually asking couldn't be answered with lances and sabers. How do you live with grief that has no remedy? How do you find meaning after injustice that cannot be undone? How do you rebuild after loss that leaves a permanent void? Those questions require a different kind of courage. Not the courage to charge into musket fire, but the courage to choose restraint when rage demands violence. The courage to accept that some wrongs cannot be made right through force. The courage to understand that winning the battle might mean losing everything that matters. Radziwiłł had physical courage in abundance. What he lacked was the moral courage to walk away from a fight he knew would destroy him regardless of outcome. The Battle of Kircholm is still studied in military academies worldwide. It demonstrates that smaller numbers can overcome larger forces through speed, shock, and tactical brilliance. It proves that horse soldiers properly used could defeat advanced infantry formations. It shows that impossible odds can be beaten by commanders desperate enough to attempt the impossible. But the larger lessons are darker and more important. Tactical brilliance without strategic vision achieves nothing lasting. You can win every battle and still lose the war. You can defeat every enemy on the field and fail to achieve your objectives because military victory is not the same as political success. Vengeance is an empty goal that destroys the person seeking it more completely than it punishes the target. Killing the enemy doesn't erase the original wrong. Blood for blood leaves everyone bloodied and nothing resolved. Some victories cost more than defeat. The Commonwealth won at Kircholm and paid for that victory with 5 years of economically devastating warfare, international isolation, internal rebellions, and a treaty that gave up everything the battle was fought to preserve. Modern Poland celebrates Kircholm as a moment of military glory. And it was. The horse soldier charge that broke a Swedish army twice its size represents military skill at its highest level. Modern Sweden studies Kircholm as a tactical lesson in what happens when larger numbers use static positions against an enemy willing to gamble everything on shock tactics. Neither nation fully confronts the moral complexity at the battle's core. Was Radziwiłł a hero defending his nation or a war criminal who murdered prisoners? Was Kircholm a necessary defense against aggression or an escalation that provoked worse violence? Could different choices have prevented 5 years of mutual destruction? There are no clean answers, only the certainty that violence creates more violence, vengeance demands more vengeance, and someone must choose to break the cycle, or it continues until both sides are exhausted, and nothing remains except casualty lists and ruined territories. Neither Konstanty nor Duke Karl had the courage to make that choice. They chose honor and pride and the satisfactions of inflicting pain on their enemies. And they both got exactly what they wanted at costs that hollowed out their victories and left them ruling over devastation disguised as triumph. Konstanty Radziwiłł died believing he had failed. But his real failure wasn't losing the war after winning the battle. His real failure was believing that military force could answer questions that had nothing to do with warfare. That killing Swedes could bring back his murdered brother, that vengeance could fill the void left by loss, that demonstrating the Commonwealth's military skill could resolve the grief eating him from inside. History remembers the brilliant horse soldier charge. It remembers the numerical impossibility of the victory. It remembers the tactical innovations and the shocking casualty ratios. It should also remember the 4,000 prisoners executed in an afternoon. The villages burned in retaliation. The Commonwealth peasants massacred in Swedish terror raids. The families destroyed on both sides. The years of suffering that achieved nothing except proving that both nations could inflict terrible violence and both were willing to do so. If this story changed how you think about victory, honor, and the true cost of vengeance, subscribe. We're telling the stories that matter, the ones that make you think differently about the past and the choices we face today. Share this with someone who needs to understand that winning battles and achieving peace are not the same thing. And tell me in the comments, what stays with you from this story? What would you have done differently? Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.